Alright, I think that this section is quite similar to this one. So the shift from the formalist ontology to the functional turn, right? The shift to functional. Let's check. Furth and Wagner, in one of the most influential critiques of SLA, directly reiterate means say it again or emphasize by saying something again, the criticisms made in our paradigm gapped papers. So Firth and Wagner wrote in 1997, whereas Sridhar and Sridhar's first paper was written in 1986, 32 years ago from this article, 2018. Alright, so Firth and Wagner also agree and also reiterate the same criticisms that Sridhar and Sridhar made. Cases in point, this means, for example, right? For example, the criticism of what Bolton calls SLA's obsession with the target language milieu as prototype acquisition environment, which means the implication that interactions with native speakers are seen to be the preferred conditions for SLA to occur. So we've already talked about this, that native speakers are less in number, are about half in number than non-native speakers. So just by having experience speaking with native speakers, this is not the only way, this is not the best way to learn language. So that is the new turn, that is the functional turn. A third point is the neglect of the relationship between language learning and language use. So people are neglecting that why we are learning a language and why we are using it. So we should learn a language to use it, right? If we don't have to use a language, if we don't have to have good pronunciation, if we don't have to have a quote-unquote standard accent, then why do we need to learn it? Or even if we don't need to have good English fluency, so we don't actually need to become fluent, right? We don't need to have so much trouble, to go through so much trouble to achieve fluency if we don't want it. If we want it, then that's a different scenario. So the relationship between language learning and language context, language use. Many of the world's English speakers are not English learners in this traditional SLA sense, but rather multi-competent English users. So again, intercultural competence about how people who can understand other language speakers, other language varieties, other types of English like Indian English, Singapore English, Australian English, Bangladeshi English, those people are actually better English users because they can understand more people. So who employ English as a lingua franca, which means as a common language in multiple ways in their daily lives. So these non-native English users are in many respects better than native English users who can only speak in English with their own people. They cannot speak with other people, or they can, even if they can, they will not understand many of the other accents of the other types of English, not only accents but also vocabulary, but also other syntax, for a range of purposes and in a variety of social settings. So native speakers are in fact restricted in these cases. Firth and Wagner also appeal for realistic studies of second language use representative of the context around the world in the form of everyday language use. So L2 refers to second language. So we already talked about this in the introduction section, that what is representative? Just picking the best students in class who get A. It is not a representative of the entire class, right? And I'm not saying that American and British people are the A's and we are the B's or C's. I'm just saying that it needs to be representative. It needs to have variety. So in order to be representative, that's why more studies should be conducted of people who speak English as their second or foreign language and in the form of everyday L2 use. Why is this important? Because when we speak in the classroom, we try to be formal, right? We are not actually authentic. We in the sense that we are not unfiltered. We are not naturally speaking in the classroom most of the time. But when we are speaking with a group of friends, or for any other cause, we are very much natural, and this sort of natural everyday L2 use should be researched. So that's what they said, Furth and Wagner. They also call for a dismantling. Dismantling means to breaking up something, destroying something, destroying the fields. I guess this is the SLA field. SLA fields, ongoing bifurcation of language acquisition, cognitive internal, and language use. Not sure what this means. I think I know, but let's be sure. Yes, I thought this was the case. The division of something into two branches or parts. So bi means two. So bifurcation means when we are making something split into two, when we are thinking of it as dichotomies like cognitive or internal. And language use, arguing for an analytic approach that was concerned with how language is used as it is being acquired through interaction and used resourcefully, contingently, and contextually. Alright, so this means that when someone is learning a language, for example, someone is in class 5, or even when someone is in class 10 or giving or even studying at university, right, they're learning English, their English language journey has not stopped. So studying those people, when they're still in the process of learning their language, of how they use the language resourcefully, means how usefully they use it, contingently, of how the reasons they use it, and contextually, on in which contexts and situations they use the language. Such a perspective leads to evaluation of quote-unquote errors, right? They are not actually errors, but just different from the norm, from the Western norm, and that shouldn't be the norm. As innovative communicative strategies and fossilization, again quotes. So fossilization is the term when if we didn't learn something from the very start, from an early part of our childhood, then learning it as an adult, it's very difficult. For example, the main example is pronunciation. So we'll see many people, we all know that they cannot actually, or they can, but they have difficulty in pronouncing the Z sound. For example, instead of zoo, they will say, or they'll mistakenly say Jew. So it's not like their pronunciation should be laughed at, but it's still different from the quote-unquote original pronunciation, right? So this term is called fossilization, because fossils, they have, their pronunciation has become fossils, because they can no longer be defossilized, or even if defossilization is possible, it is extremely difficult, because you may say to that person that no, it is not Jew, it is zoo, but they will not be able to actually they may be able to repeat after you that okay, zoo, but when they will say the word again, it will probably be Jew again. So this is fossilization, when someone doesn't learn about the pronunciation, or it can be other things as well. For example, subject verb agreement, he is, she is. Some people still make confusion about this, like they say he are, she are, they is, I are. So these things, if they are learned in the childhood, during childhood, then these mistakes don't happen that much. So anyway, they are also quoting this in brackets. So this means that these are not actually, should not be considered errors, because they are they just have some indigenous flavor. Like what is the problem if Bangladeshi people say Jew? This is only a problem if we make it a problem, right? So Firth and Wagner are saying that these shouldn't be considered as problems, or at least Sridhar and Sridhar are saying, because it's not a quote from Firth and Wagner, it's from Sridhar and Sridhar, the original writers of this article. As identification with local norms, so you see, like Bangladeshi flavor or Indian flavor, and a pragmatic, which means contextual, redefinition of the acquisitional target, like how we actually acquire the language in terms of intelligibility and communicability and interpretability. So intelligibility is when we can understand something, comprehend something. Communicability is when we can successfully communicate with other people, and interpretability, I think this is the same as intelligibility, like we can interpret what someone is saying. Well, for example, if it's a metaphor, then people who are not that much competent in English, they will not understand it. Or if it's a complex sentence, it may be difficult to understand. Whereas intelligibility is more related to clarity of pronunciation, I think, rather than an arbitrary native-like correctness. So again, I think the same the same argument is given here, but with a different focus, with a functional turn, right? But the arguments are the same as in the previous subsection. So what we can write here, we can write that most SLA researchers now prioritize the functional aspect of language rather than the structural aspect, and this paradigm shift is influenced or was influenced by world Englishes. Alright. 2.5. The multilingual turn. As Larsen Freeman notes in this issue, the focus on what it means to be multilingual when one of the languages is English is, in my opinion, a key contribution of world Englishes and has the potential to infuse new energies into SLA research in the future. So what he means is that Larsen Freeman says that the definition, we say that the notion of what a multilingual is in our minds, this is very important to the field of world Englishes and also the field of SLA research. Why? Because one of the most impressive impacts of world Englishes on SLA has been what Stephen May has termed the multilingual turn. SLA was challenged to think beyond one language at a time and conceive of the learners' and users' linguistic performance as interactive, integrated, and translingual competence. So let's highlight these three terms up to competence. So interactive competence, integrated, and translingual competence. So interactive means that we learn language by interacting with one another. It doesn't just happen automatically, it doesn't happen without practice. And integrated and translingual, I think they refer to our other languages, right? Like we integrate with and interact with other people who have other languages as their first language, as their mother tongue. And we also need to have translingual competence, which is the same as intercultural competence, to be able to converse with, to be able to understand other people who are not native English users, but like to be able to understand and communicate with as many types of people as possible. The multilingual turn called for in our 1986 paper and again in Kachru and Sridhar has been gathering steam. So this is a metaphor that means that this multilingual turn is being popularized now, it's becoming more and more popular. SLA research from the late 1960s onwards was conducted without reference to the disconnect between SLA and multilingualism. Alright, was conducted without reference to the disconnect. So there was no acknowledgement that multilingualism and SLA, they were not actually analyzed together. They were separately considered. This was particularly surprising, we observed, since the fundamental goal of SLA is, or ought to be, or should be, to explain the acquisition of bilingualism. So according to Sridhar, bilingualism and multilingualism, they are very much dependent and very much they should be discussed in the field of SLA as well, because they are very related, very relevant. One would naturally expect it to make use of the perspectives developed in the extensive studies of bi and multilingualism, especially those in traditionally multilingual contexts, which are natural laboratories of SLA. So they're again saying that SLA research is very much relevant to multilingualism, bilingualism, and SLA research should be connected with them. This monolingual bias has many roots. The reason why multilingualism and bilingualism was not connected with SLA before was that there was a hegemony of the monolingual bias. So these are the reasons for the monolingual bias. Let's highlight this. SLA's apparent fixation, which means apparent focus, like they are only focused on the monolingual target language settings. Alright, this is one. The other is SLA's essentialist ontology. So one is native, like monolingual target language settings. They only focused on American, Australian, British settings. Another is essential ontology, which, as Ortega points out, locked SLA into a monolingual worldview, into a very structuralist perspective, as if the British and the American way of writing and speaking English is the best, and that is the main structure. That structure is inherently better than African American English, than Indian English, and other types of English. Alright. Other culprits are the prescriptivist worship of the direct method and the purist's horror of any kind of language mixing. So prescriptivist is a term used in our field. Let's make a comment here. So prescriptivism, purist, people who think there should, prescriptivism isn't people, like the idea that there should be strict rules which must be followed. Right, so prescribe. So we say the doctor gives us prescriptions, right? But that is a good thing. Doctors are supposed to give us prescriptions. However, if people say that no, you cannot use language like this, you cannot say Jew, you have to say zoo, so that is prescriptivism. And you cannot make two negation words in one sentence. For example, African Americans say I ain't seen nothing, so they say two negation words, right? I ain't, which is I have not, or I did not seen nothing. So it should be I ain't seen anything, but instead of this, they say two negation words. But they all the African American English, it isn't the case that African American English is faulty. In fact, African American English is quite rich, and in many respects, and in some respects at least, quite richer than the English language, than the quote-unquote standard English language, because there are some emphasis markers in African American English which is not present in American English, in British English. So these are some reasons why monolingual bias was there, because of some prescriptivists, and and the direct method is also one of the language teaching methods, which was about making the language classroom. So it's a very outdated approach. It's not communicative, and it was also influenced by a very grammar translation approach, and a very outdated approach, which is not the case anymore. And the purist, the language purist, which is similar to the prescriptivist, horror of any kind of language mixing, like any kind of language mixing and changing the nature of English, or even code switching in between English sentences if we use Bangla or other languages. The monolingual bias of SLA and TESOL, which is teaching English to speakers of other languages. This is an language teaching branch, together with the other shortcomings discussed here, derailed SLA. So it held SLA back, because people were only concerned about monolingual settings, not bilingual or multilingual settings. So that's why research was not as progressive as it could be. This bias led to misleading characterizations of the process of acquisition in terms of interlanguage, fossilization, and interference. So people, as I said, they talked about fossilization, they talked about interference, that the first language interferes with the acquisition of the second language, that we are Bangla speakers, and if we learn English, then some features of our Bangla will interfere our learning of English. So these things were studied more than actually more unbiased studies of every culture, of how people use English in every culture. That's because people prioritized monolingual settings more than multilingual settings. the product of acquisition, which is the result. Dismissing the vast majority of second language learners as failures. So they used to think that most second language learners, they are not actually successful English users. And curbing means like destroying or oppressing its explanatory scope. It led to a negative characterization of the overwhelming majority of L2 acquirers and users as speakers of interlanguages. Interlanguage means who speak more than one language and communicate with more than one language. That is, as failed monolinguals rather than successful bilinguals. So those people who are not able to actually master the norms of British and American English, those people were actually considered to be failed language speakers. So this is a very traditional point of view, right? So World Englishes has changed this point of view now. Such theories condemn vibrant second languages and their speakers to a permanent subaltern state. So they discriminate against those people who cannot speak English properly. Like they are trying to learn English, but there is so much difference between their English, their pronunciation, their fluency, their sentence structure from the center, right? From the quote-unquote center. But now, as we know, that it's not single-centered but pluricentered. In the World English's perspective, SLA is viewed as an organic, evolutionary component of developing a verbal repertoire. Repertoire means arsenal or a set of like we are developing a set of tools. English is one set of tools, Bangla is one set of tools. The more languages we learn, the better it is. The better we can think, the better we can communicate. Where the two or more languages interact with and influence one another, sometimes complementing, sometimes overlapping, to create a composite multilingual competence. So yeah, L1 interference is of course there. L1 means the first language, L2 means second language. So yes, when we try to learn a second language, some things of our first language will interfere, like accent, like our Bangla alphabet doesn't have Z or the ja sound, ja. Like French, it has the ja sound. English doesn't actually have that, but English does have Z sound, the za sound. Bangla doesn't. Even though Bangla has 3 ja, borika jo, untista jo, jo, and ja, but still it doesn't have the za sound. So yes, sometimes it interferes, but we also don't have to consider it as an error, right? It's just a different type of pronunciation. And where was I? Right, sometimes complementing, sometimes and I think that this is not just sometimes but many times, because if we learn one or two languages more, like if we have a second language, if we have a third language, we can think more, because some things are in one language but aren't in another. For example, can you think of the English word for Obhiman, the Bangla word Obhiman? You cannot just say that it is anger or frustration. It has a slightly different meaning, right? And if we didn't know the meaning of Bangla, if we didn't know Bangla, we wouldn't be able to think of Obhiman. Maybe if someone like if we say that Obhiman koreche, she Obhiman koreche, but if we didn't know Bangla, we couldn't actually perhaps we couldn't actually think of this situation, of this fact that someone could do Obhiman, right? So there are of course many other words, there are many other ways of viewing the world. For example, English is very rich in scientific words, right? Because most English is the global language, that's why most scientific words are English. There are equivalents in other languages as well, but English is by far the most rich in terms of science and technology. Alright, so that was slightly a tangent. Let's move on. To create a composite multilingual competence. So anyway, so variation, so here we shouldn't think of variation like we speak English and we write English a different way. It's not a bad thing, it's rather a good thing. This is based on a sociolinguistically realistic appreciation of the role of English as a single language or the other tongue around the world. English is only one of the languages in the learner's or user's verbal repertoire. Okay, so it's not like we learn English that we can do anything. It's the best language in the world. It's not like that. It's like English is as good as your English shouldn't have a value more than Bangla, right? Yes, it does have instrumental value. Like if you learn English, you can do more things than with your Bangla outside of the country. If you learn English rather than Korean, you can do more things in America, right? But besides those instrumental reasons, there is no specific reason why English is better or worse than any other language. Alright. This perspective also defines the expected outcome of SLA. The target language does not have to perform the entire gamut, means entire repertoire or entire thing of functions performed by a language in its monolingual or native setting. The several languages, often more than two, in the communities and individuals' verbal repertoire together cover the range of functions. So it's not a form of replacing something, right? So it's not like I'm Bangla bole jabo, English shikbo. It's not like that. Like I'm not. People shouldn't try to replace one language with another, but rather they should learn as many languages as they can. Like it's not a race to learn as many languages as you can, but if you do have the opportunity, and if it's not a very big trouble, then you should learn as many languages as you can, and English will help you in instrumentally for many things. And English cannot replace your mother tongue, because your mother tongue probably has a very different cultural and very rich cultural elements that English does not have and cannot bridge that gap with you, pun intended. As Hagen, Grosjean and others have observed, multilinguals acquire as much of the competence of the other languages as they need. So it's like the amount of language proficiency you need, most likely what will happen is that you will require it naturally. So since most of us do not actually need mastery of English, or at least the standards of British and American English with them as the norm, so that's why most of us do not actually reach that. But if you do want to reach that for integrative reasons or even instrumental reasons, practice inshallah will do that. And that's why this channel is here, Impromptu English with Nyan, to become more fluent. Therefore, the relevant model of bilingualism for SLA is an additive one. It's like 1, 1, 1, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1. You learn English, that's a plus 1. You learn Bangla, plus 1. You learn Arabic, plus 1. You learn Spanish, plus 1. It's not a replacive philosophy, like one will replace the other, but rather additive. One that yields means results in a complementary competence, means one will help the other, be a complement to the other, not a replacive or a duplicate one. This is the most important sentence in this section. This has been explicitly the position of the we paradigm, or the world English paradigm. The multilingual turn of SLA aligns it more closely with world Englishes. So I think that there is no need to take notes for this one, because this is the most important point. We can just write here, this is the note, right?